Welcome to another video on Snappy Insights by Dr. Mike. Today, our topic will be the historical analysis of global politics. And we're trying to see how do we understand global politics from a historical perspective. All right, what are some historical evidences or historical incidents or events that help us better understand global politics today? All right. Now, you might wonder, why do we need a historical understanding of global politics? Of course, there are so many trends going on, in the world as we know it today. There's international conflict between Israel and Hamas. There's the Russian incident and so many other things going on in the global scene. Okay, now what does history have to do with all these things? You will agree with me that the past is linked to the present, and of course, also helps us to make informed guesses about the future as well. Okay, so there's that link between the past, the present, and the future, and that's why a knowledge of history is very, very important to understand, the present. All right. Now, it is going to be difficult for us to attempt a comprehensive historical analysis, taking all the events in history one after the other and trying to draw trends or draw inferences from those events, to understand today's events, basically on the global scene. But what we can do instead is to highlight some of the significant, um, very significant events or incidents that have happened in the past, and then try to see how do they help us understand where we are today in the international scene as regards politics and relations among states. Okay, and so that's what we're going to be doing. We're going to be highlighting some of these very, very significant events and see, how they help us to understand um, today's politics, today's world. The first one we're going to be talking about is the Peace of Westphalia. All right, now every international relations student, must have come across this. In fact, at the very elementary stages, either in your introductory classes in international relations, you know, you must have come across the Peace of Westphalia, which is one of the very, very cardinal points, in understanding international relations today. All right. Between 1618 and 1648, there was what we call the 30-year war in Europe, where countries were basically fighting, over the right of whether or not there should be a state religion, in those countries, Denmark, France, Austria, Sweden, and these countries. Within those 30 years, there was basically a war to determine whether or not a state religion was going to be in place. All right. Now in 1648, that war basically came to an end with a treaty, which is called the Treaty of Westphalia, or the Peace of Westphalia, as you might want to call it. And that treaty introduced the concept of territorial sovereignty, and of course state sovereignty as well. Insisting that states had equal rights, and of course included non-interference within the internal affairs of those states. You will agree that these are major principles in the international system today. Every state is considered to be equal with other states, regardless of the size, regardless of the population, regardless of the land mass, regardless of their military strength or whatever else, characteristic that state has, in terms of status and all of that. It is seen as equal to even the biggest states. So big and small states are seen in the international system as equal in principle, even though of course we know that, you know, in reality that perhaps can be argued. All right, but in principle, states are supposed to be equal, are seen as equal, and of course they are also seen as sovereign. So there shouldn't be any kind of interference in the internal affairs of those states by other states. So these are principles that still subsist in the international system today, which can be traced back to the Treaty of Westphalia or the Peace of Westphalia. So that is one significant historical event that still bears a meaning for us in international relations today, and of course global politics, because these principles, as we have noted, are principles that still govern global politics today. Another incident, of course, we can't talk about the history of the international system without talking about the world wars, the First World War and the Second World War. And of course, we know um, how devastating, these wars were, even though the level of sophistication in terms of the Second World War was slightly different from the first because, of course, societies had advanced. More weaponry had been manufactured. There was a little more sophistication. Knowledge had increased, and of course, armies had become better equipped in terms of technical, you know, know-how, in terms of combat readiness, and so on and so forth. So the complexity and the little nature of the Second World War happened to be, slightly different, significantly in fact, different from the First World War. But that's not the case. All right. The two wars are very important for us to understand international relations today, whether in terms of the causes of these wars, why the wars, began in the first place, how the wars progressed, and how they even came to an end. All right. In the First World War, of course, we know the role of the US um, in brokering peace. And of course, because they joined the war, the 14 points plan, and all of those things um, together helped to secure, the peace, the Treaty of Versailles, which was signed in France and led to an end in the First World War. And of course, the US also was instrumental in ending the Second World War, by bombing Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. All right. But interestingly, is to understand the changes in military technology that has shaped the way combat is done today. Even as we speak, even though we see the kinds of warfare that goes on, we see the level of sophistication of the weapons that are being used, you know, that are being manufactured. More states are having access, to more deadly weapons that are very, very pocket sized. So which also increases the level of devastation in this conflict as well. So we have gone beyond crude methods of warfare, crude instruments, weapons, to more sophisticated and advanced weapons. All right. So the point I'm making is that the nature of warfare has changed, you know, and that continues to happen, and that will continue to happen as long as knowledge continues to increase. All right. And we also see the issue of human rights protection, you know, the issue of um, torture and abuse of vulnerable population, women, children, and what have you, in these conflicts. So these are things that continue to occur even in contemporary warfare, which of course we can trace back to the two world wars, as a trend. So if you want to understand how conflicts continue to unfold, and perhaps the complexity and intensity of these conflicts, you know, these two world wars will give us an idea, into how we got here, and perhaps could even help us to attempt a scientific guess of what the future of warfare is going to be like. All right. I've talked about the 14 points plan, which of course was an instrumental part of helping to broker peace in the First World War, you know, leading to the Treaty of Versailles, and of course, the League of Nations, as we discussed in the previous video. Um, the Great Depression also in Europe was one of the aftermaths of the First World War as well, and eventually tied to the Second World War, which led to what which also was one of the causes of the Second World War too. And of course we know what economic disadvantage, you know, um, lack, poverty, lack of access to resources and all of that. We know how much those are potent, to bring about conflict. All right, and of course Hiroshima, Nagasaki in 1945, are also tales. The bombing in those cities are also tales that help us to that have still helped even to till today to regulate the use of atomic energy, the use of atomic weapons, and how these weapons are stored, and all of the conversations around chemical and biological weapons, are tied to what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and a desire to prevent a reoccurrence of those incidents or those events. All right. The third issue will be European colonialism and, of course, legacies of these colonial efforts. All right. The 20th century. and some part of the 19th century, later part of the 19th century, was ruled with, colonial rule in Africa, in Asia, Latin America. Countries were ruled by so-called superpowers. Okay, and towards the mid 20th century, uh, colonial powers began to hand over independence or governance back to the states. So states began to achieve self-governance and independence across Africa, beginning with Libya, you know, um, Ghana, Nigeria, and all the rest of them. So, so these colonial practices, as well intended as the Europeans and the superpowers will argue that they were, had negative effects, which of course scholars have carefully documented, had negative effects, and arguably still have some legacies, negative legacies that still occur in these territories. All right. Some of these happen to be revolutionary movements, that continue to rear their heads now and then in many of these states which were formerly colonies. We have ethnic issues, we have racial issues, you know, um, we have state failure. Foreign aid remains a very, very major issue. All right, that continues to dominate the debates in international spaces. Um, where African nations, where these developing nations, as it were, have to interact with developed nations. There's still that conversation around aid, how much aid should be given, how should it be given, how much aid should the developing nations receive, and all these conversations continue to be dominant in international relations today, in the global space today, and of course we can trace them, back to the colonial experiences of these countries as the legacies that have remained several decades after this colonial rule has ended. All right. Now, this issue is argued in most literature, where scholars have argued that colonial territories or territories that were formerly colonized, right, have not properly managed themselves, and that's why they have remained underdeveloped. Whereas others have argued that there are certain structural, legacies, um, certain policy legacies, certain ideological, philosophical legacies that were relics of the colonial times that have kept these um, these countries, these states, tied to the apron strings of their colonial master, of their former colonial masters, and that's why it's been difficult for them to develop beyond, or to grow beyond developing status to advance to become developed economies. All right, but all of these are conversations that continue to make the rounds today in international studies in global politics, and we're saying that these issues, these conversations, you know, can be significantly tied to colonial experiences and the legacies of those experiences um, in history. All right, the Cold War is another issue that we must also examine. All right, the Cold War was fought a war, a bloodless war, largely between the USSR and the United States, um, popularly known as the East and the West, respectively. These were disputes over which economic model should be operational in territories that were governed by the West, or territories that were influenced by the West and the East, as it were. All right. So the West advocated for capitalism, while the East and USSR and all the other allies of the USSR advocated for socialism as you know as an acceptable mode of economics. And so the differences and the tension between these two models of economic administration and governance were what led to what we call the Cold War. And of course, it spanned for quite a while between 1945, after the Second World War ended, up to the 1990s. All right, when countries eventually began to decide for themselves, perhaps with the influence of their allies, whether US or USSR, what economic system they were going to operate. And you saw that incidentally with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1990, 1991. All right, many of the former USSR allies and the Soviet Union states adopted the Western ideologies of capitalism, you know, of market forces determining economic issues, and of course that has predominantly dominated many states even today. All right, that has dominated many states today, and you find out that those states that still advocate for capitalism, the likes of Russia, the likes of China, in North Korea, they still seem tend to form that clique that seems to be at antagonism with the West and the capitalist ideologies, and democracy, political ideologies of the West. So that was essentially the crux of the Cold War, and these issues are still relevant, are still prominent today. You still see the tension between Eastern Europe and Western Europe. You still see the tension between North Korea and South Korea. You still see the tension between the US, and China. And of course, these tensions here and there are essentially tensions that are a fallout of the Cold War, and still, reemphasize what the Cold War was about. So if you're going to understand the reason behind these tensions that are growing, among these countries that I've mentioned today, and why these tensions appear to be unresolved, all right, it will be very, very important to have that understanding of the Cold War and what the Cold War was about, to better appreciate these current and ongoing tensions among these states. Number five, would be the US primacy or the US supremacy and supposed big brother status in the global space. All right. Of course, after the Second World War, which the US predominantly won, came out victorious as the hegemon, as the superpower, basically. Subsequently, with the fall of the Soviet Union in the 1990s, the US predominantly has continues to pride itself, as the superpower, as the global superpower, as the global big brother. But of course, we see that status continues to be challenged by developing nations, by developing economies, and even some other rogue states, North Korea, Cuba, Iran, and all these other countries, China, continue to challenge the status of the US as a hegemon, you know. And of course, we know that with these other economies rising, that puts the US on an edge, to continue to do all that it can to see that it retains that position, which arguably, it might be difficult to retain that for a long, long time. So there's that issue of rogue states challenging this status of the US as the hegemon. There's also the issue of nuclear proliferation. All right, after 1945, the US happened to be the country with with nuclear power. Eventually the USSR joined, and now there are about nine or so or more states, either nine or ten thereabout, states that possess the nuclear weapon, and these states continue to be a threat to one another and to global peace and security as well. So the US is challenged on all fronts. The US status in the international system continues to be challenged on all fronts. All right. We see growing fundamentalism. The 9/11 attack on US soil by terrorist organizations, it happens to be one of the biggest blows that the US has have experienced from fundamental radical groups. And of course, since then there have been other pockets of, attempted and successful terror attacks, and even several shootings that have been motivated by terrorist ideologies, and so on and so forth. So the US is put on the edge. Um, Challenge these organizations, these ideologies are challenging the supremacy and the status of the US as a hegemon in the global system. There's the recent Russian invasion of Ukraine. Despite all the warnings and the diplomatic efforts that the US made, Russia went ahead to invade Ukraine, and of course that war has lingered now for almost 3 years. And the US has been able to achieve very little in terms of bringing about a resolution. Instead, they have continued to arm Ukraine, you know, to put them in a better position to not lose out in the conflict. All right, but of course, with Trump coming back to power, we'll see how that unfolds. There's also the issue of Israel and Hamas, you know, and Lebanon, the conflicts that are going on in these areas. So these are issues that continue to challenge the US status and primacy in the global space. All right, and we can only wait and see for how long the US retains that superpower position, you know and how long it continues, or how long it stays as the global big brother, and continues to preside, over debates and discussions and dialogue within the international system. So the point we're making is that there has been, and there continues to be, so many attempts, so many efforts, so many um, incidences that have challenged and that continue to challenge the status of the US in the international space, as a self-acclaimed hegemon, or rather as a superpower, within the international system. That status continues to be challenged. So the point I'm making is that, the US status as a superpower, as the hegemon, in the international system, continues to be challenged by these historical and even recent events, that continue to put a strain on on the US, and put the US at edge, to continue to prove, its status within the international system. And finally, we'll look at the war on terror as well. All right, with the 9/11 attack on the US, the US has continued to lead, in global war on terror, in Iraq and Afghanistan. There have been so many US campaigns, anti-terror campaigns, even in Africa and in Asia, across the world. The US continues to support and to lead in several aspects, in clamping down on terrorist organizations, in trying to eradicate terrorist networks, and we can also see the support that the US gave to Israel, when Hamas attacked. We can see how much of a support, how much support, Israel got from the US to go after Hamas, and to, as it were, destroy the Hamas network, you know, because of that attack that Hamas did on Israel in October 2023. So the point we're making in all of this is the fact that understanding global politics today, we have to go back to history to see what are some of the important, significant events and trends that have taken place in the past that can help us understand, the current happenings in the international system today. And some of those that we have highlighted are the Peace of Westphalia. We have highlighted the two world wars, the First and the Second World Wars, and how these helped to shape, and are continuing to shape, conflict and warfare even today. We talked about European colonial rule and the legacies of colonial rule. We talked about the Cold War. All right. We talked about the US primacy and the US position status as superpower, and how these continue to be challenged by several incidences and, events even today. And of course, now we talked about the war on terror. Understanding the war on terror, we have to also go back to see, how did this war begin? How did the US become this prominent in advancing or in leading war on terror? And to what end? You know, so understanding these contemporary issues must be rooted in a firm and somewhat, sufficient analysis of historical events, to try and tie them to see how those historical events, shed light on understanding these current incidences. With this knowledge, with the knowledge of both the history and the current, we can, as it were, um, predict to a large extent what the future would likely hold, for the international system in these very, very many areas that we have spoken about. All right. So that's where we're going to stop. That's where we're going to end the video for today. We have been discussing today the historical analysis of the global politics. So if this is something that you think you have benefited from, consider subscribing to this channel. We'll be putting out videos on a weekly basis, hopefully, and of course, trying to address issues that are of prominence, important topics, subject matters in humanities and social sciences. And of course, if you have any topic that you want us to discuss, please put them in put it in the chat, in the comment section rather, and I'll do well to make a presentation on that as well. Thank you so much for your time, and until the next video, bye bye.